Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. 各位下午好. Welcome to this inaugural North Asia Cape post-COVID webinar. We're all going through a challenging time, which has obliged businesses, schools, institutions across New Zealand to rethink and reinvent their activities. The North Asia Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence is no different. We have begun already to recast our programs and activities to cope with the new circumstances and the new opportunities that these circumstances offer. So welcome, and we look forward to your views on this webinar and generally on how we can contribute to the success of New Zealanders in building their skills to engage productively with the cultures, peoples, and economies of China, Japan, and Korea. Our speaker this afternoon, as they say, needs no introduction. David Mahon has worked in China for over 30 years, most recently as an investment banker and business consultant. He's traveled the length and breadth of China and knows the place extremely well. So his task is to, in 15 minutes, give us an overview of what we should understand is going on now with China and us. David, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And good afternoon, everybody. China is going through one of the greatest challenges since perhaps the 1990s. I think if we look at the Chinese economy, we first of all have to understand what assumptions we bring to it. And one of the things that we're seeing in the economy, and our offices in Beijing and Ningbo try and track as much as they can the various key sectors, China is genuinely in recovery. Domestic consumption is returning. Manufacturing is close to, or perhaps even beyond, 90% of pre-COVID capacity. And there is a measure of confidence in the country that gives us the sense that the worst scenarios that were being considered for China are probably not accurate. China still will have a bad year when it comes to the data. We're not expecting anything more than perhaps 2 or 3% GDP growth. And it may be even difficult to achieve that. But that's not so important. China is an economy that trades largely with itself. It depends very much on the rest of the world for many things. But a lot of countries and a lot of companies are looking at China's export performance to measure whether or not China can recover within itself, or the world has demand for what China has to sell it. But China is not an export economy. That's a myth that has been maintained for over 2 decades. There are periods when it's been crucial to China's growth, but largely China trades with itself. And if you take net exports, if you bring the imports that come to make the exports, in the last 5 years, China's exports have been negligible in terms of a contribution to GDP growth. So this is a country that's recovering, driven very much by its own economic engines. We think that China's problems and its big struggles to come deal far more with its relationship globally. And China has, as I think we're all observing, a real issue in its US relationship. The US seems determined by any means, and many of them seem quite reckless, to contain China, to keep China from emerging, particularly in its technology sector. So when one looks at the coming months and the next perhaps 18 months, one of the factors which will be a wild card will be the manner in which America is successful in deepening this attempt to contain China. There are certain areas too where we still don't quite know the depth of coronavirus's impact on Chinese society. The general numbers are good, and we see that although there was perhaps a 6 to 12 day delay, once the central government became involved to question the transparency of the Chinese government in managing this is rather pointless. We see a good degree of transparency. It's relative. All countries struggle to try and plumb the real factors of how many people are ill, how many people have died even. To some extent, it's very, very hard to cover. So the Chinese government seems to us to have brought as much transparency as they themselves have managed to achieve. And it was the upgrade of the deaths in Wuhan by another 1,000 that gave me the sense that this was an expression of that need they have themselves for transparency and the wish to be transparent with their own people. So I think we're going into a situation where, absent a major return and another surge of illness, perhaps in the autumn and winter this year, the Chinese economy can perhaps play the role that it's played in the past, which, if you look at the global financial crisis, China was the engine. It was the starter motor, perhaps, not the entire engine, but it helped bring the world back into a much more healthy situation. And I think if we look at the fact that China is 1/3 of global trade, its recovery is crucial for the recovery of the other major economies of the world. If they allow this to occur, and I say allow because the forces of nationalism, concepts of national isolation, are worryingly prevalent in a number of major economies in the world, not just the US. Within the European Union, there are some very strong voices that are concerning because the world can recover if it works together, if it takes a measure of globalization as the key. So it's an interesting time to observe also where China is going to lose markets. And like every country, there are major issues for China on tourism. There are major issues for China, not because of government regulations, but around the sort of public gatherings that drive the entertainment sector. And while now people are able to return to cinemas, they're not doing so. So there's that natural caution which people feel after a shock of something as momentous as this coronavirus. One area that has also really intrigued us is the degree to which the Chinese government has garnered even more support, or the party, I would say, has managed to become even more popular than it was before coronavirus. There is a Western view that there is a draconian Chinese Communist Party that, through fear and many levels of social control, keep its population subdued, and they're obedient, and therefore they have tremendous power. It doesn't actually work that way. That's not the China that I live in. It's not the China that my business partners and colleagues live in. The China that I live in is a very personally open and spontaneous environment. People discuss anything with each other. People have conversations even at official levels. Now, we're surprised in banquets with party secretaries and vice mayors of sizable cities when they will discuss the merits and demerits of Xi Jinping's policies. They'll even talk about his desire to maintain his tenure as president and changing the constitution to allow it. So it's a much more open society and one much more deeply involved in a conversation with itself than I think a lot of people give it. So coming out of this great shock to the society and economy, it's interesting to see that there is a sense that the government has managed things well and many lives were saved. And even as people who deal with Wuhan, and by coincidence during this crisis, we had a client in Wuhan, a Chinese company, and we had some reflection of the attitude they had to the draconian measures that were being undertaken to try and control the virus there. And yes, there were some mistakes, and a lot of bad things did occur as that city tried to develop the capacity to deal with the number of sick and dying people that it was facing. But ultimately, there's a sense that all that could be done was done. So I think any view that, which is a very common, I would say political view, I don't think business people seem to hold this so much, but one day the Communist Party will move aside and a better China will emerge. I don't believe that. I believe that this Communist Party will continue to mutate, will continue to adapt to the society that it is part of, and that the real development and changes in China are driven by the grassroots forces of the people of China. If you look at now at party officials, they're educated, well-traveled men and women. They're people who have the expertise in the fields that they're obliged to deal with or they've taken on as responsibilities. They're a lot smarter than a lot of politicians and people who take ministerial roles in Western countries in many cases. But there is an issue facing China, and I think it's one of developing a real flow of soft power. It talks about soft power, and I think the Chinese government imagines an idea of soft power, but I disagree with its definition, because soft power is when you allow your media, you allow your arts, you allow the creativity of your society to spontaneously address any issue, to actually allow itself to become a culture that is from the people and from the grassroots. That's where America has been so successful. And in this, China has been unsuccessful. Its, let's say, firm economic power is undeniable. Its political influence, I think the political system of China is not being exported. And I don't believe that it is intended to be, but it really needs that soft power, those things that win people's hearts, whether it's what Korea has managed to do so well with popular culture, what film for many, many years in Taiwan was a phenomenon from a society that had been controlled for so long. So I think in these areas, this is still something that China needs to look to. So as I look at the potential of China, as we consider China in terms of an economy to engage with, these are some of the things we look for. But for New Zealand, what China is becoming and what China has been becoming even before the coronavirus is a good thing. It's a country that will consume many of the core products that we produce and also the technology and science that we possess and have yet to share with China in a more widespread way. So we are lucky. We're a very fortunate country in that our engagement, our free trade agreement, puts us in a position that from a business perspective and a commercial perspective, we have tremendous potential still in the Chinese economy. So I would end with the fact that I think that we'll pass these current foreign affairs glitches. Hopefully we'll have a single party taking power in September, and we won't suffer some of the more distracting needs and electioneering of our minority parties. But that is an issue in China and the media at the moment, and one we need to handle that very carefully. And perhaps as businesses, sometimes it's good to express our own views as clearly as we can when we're dealing with Chinese officials and our Chinese business partners. I see now it's 15 minutes, and so at the risk of being long-winded, I'll hand it back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, David. That was nicely succinct and has some ideas there that we can all get our teeth into. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Send us a written question, brief written question, and we'll sort through those. But it's my pleasure now to introduce Tony Browne. Tony began his engagement with China way back, I think, in 1973, and has been going strong ever since. Most of you will know him as the former ambassador in the first decade of this century in Beijing. So, Tony, some comments.
Tony, sorry, you're muted and I can't seem to unmute you. Could you click your unmute button?
Right, it's past that.
It's great.
My apologies. And well, thank you, David, for those for that, and thank you also for the many years of support for New Zealand in China, for New Zealand business, for the New Zealand government, and for the New Zealand embassy. For many years that you have worked very closely with those of us that have been based in Beijing and those that have been trading with China. I guess one of the bonuses of our current shutdown of the borders is that we actually get you to have you in New Zealand and to see and hear more of you than we normally do. What you have to say, I think, is very relevant, but I'm not sure that I will necessarily endorse everything that you have to say. I think you're absolutely right to look at China today as being an economy, a country that is approaching the next little while with confidence, with optimism, with an economy that is undoubtedly in growth mode again after a difficult period, but it is not an economy that is advancing without a number of inherent difficulties, not because of COVID-19, but inherent problems that China has had to address for some time. Now, in 2013, at the third plenum of the government, Xi Jinping had just come to power, and he laid out a series of economic reforms that had emerged from extensive consultation on the question of what did China need to do to secure its economic future. And it was a comprehensive, and I think most Chinese economists, let alone global economists, felt that the prescription that appeared back then was very much along the right lines in terms of giving the Chinese economy the potential to grow in a way that most international economists felt it should. And in the 7 years since then, that reform has stultified. It's been replaced by a program of political control and the reinforcement of the state sector in the Chinese economy. In other words, I think a lot of those problems are not new, but they are still, in a sense, new in that they are still part of the challenge of governing China. And that's why I was very interested at the end of March, the Party Central Committee and the State Council, the peak bodies of both the party and the state and the government, jointly issued recommendations for further market reforms and what China needed to do in the post-COVID environment. And a lot of what was being prescribed and being identified as being the directions that China should take are in fact not to further double down on party control, not to further double down on the state economy, on the state-owned enterprises and so on, but in fact to go back to much of the vision from 7 years ago. And what this joint statement talked about was more flexibility in land administration, to free up controls on household residency, on the hukou system, to free up labor mobility, to align prices more closely with market rates in lending and deposits, exchange rates, in civil service salaries, and so on. It called for a reform of financial institutions and to ease market entry requirements for foreign firms in the financial sector. And it called for greater development and standardization in the technology sector. Now, all of these, if that in fact is a program that the government of China, the party, is prepared to endorse next week at the National People's Congress. If this is, as one would think is likely, a harbinger of the type of domestic restructuring that is emerging as a consensus as to where China now needs to go, then I think that the type of optimism that you described, David, about the future of the Chinese economy is going to be reinforced in spades, because this is going to make China a more formidable domestic economy and give it a foundation against which much of the other issues that we're having to come to terms with now are going to be played out. Now, you've talked about the international environment. I think that there are two things that we need to bear, which are going to be crucial for New Zealand in terms of our future engagement with China. The first, as I've said, is China's internal economic direction. The second is the international environment. And I have to say, you talked about a reckless policy in the way in which certain countries are trying to contain, to decouple from China. Seems to me that the decoupling that is being argued for from Washington has an awful lot in the way of similarities with US policy towards Japan in the 1930s. It's, I wouldn't want to push the analogy too far, but there is an element in there, and it's a very, very worrying one. Against that, though, I don't think that the US capacity to decouple, to make the break with China. Mr. Trump talks about a complete break with China. I just don't think that's possible. You can't break and stop a 650 billion trade relationship. You can't stop and simply undermine or pretend that Chinese holding of $1 trillion worth of US government debt isn't part of the relationship that has to be managed. At the same time, I don't think that Xi is pushing for a break with the US. Certainly, he doesn't want to see a military consequences of a loosening of links with the United States, but confronting China is becoming the fundamental driving principle of US foreign policy. And the next 6 months will be particularly fraught, but they're not going to change too much after November. I mean, what is emerging in Washington in terms of the dialogue, the rhetoric around China, is not simply something that I identified with the Republican Party. There is emerging a sort of national consensus, which is going to make the future of that, the most important global relationship, all that much more difficult. We haven't got time to go into all of that now, but there are serious implications for New Zealand. Where are we going to stand in this emerging questioning about the relationship between and the merits of trying to move further towards working with China as against working against China? Can we protect ourselves from those consequences? We're seeing manifestations in Australia at the moment, with Australia aligning itself in ways which we've been very careful, despite your comments about our foreign minister, David. The Prime Minister yesterday was extremely careful and I think extremely sensible in her description of the relationship. But China is saying that Australia is questioning Australian policy, and the Fox News of China, the Global Times, put it 3 days ago. that Australia is delusional if it thinks there will not be economic repercussions from the political state positions that it's taken. Are we, in fact, in that same camp as the Australians? Not so much do we put ourselves in that camp, but do the Chinese see us in that same camp as the Australians? If there is a further problem, a distancing of China's relationship with Canberra, are we going to get caught up in that? Are we, in fact, moving into a relationship with China where the economic the potential of the relationship, not just to be the starter motor once again to pull us out of a recession, but to continue to sustain the growth in New Zealand, the New Zealand economy? Is that something that we are going to be are we going to be in a political position to benefit from that? I mean, what are the marker points for New Zealand? What are the neuralgic issues for China in terms of ensuring that we have a secure and prosperous relationship with China? And there are some. And I'll stop here. But it seems to me that what we do on Huawei, what the Prime Minister, what the Foreign Minister say, and what we say about Taiwan, they are all going to be issues that are as important for us, perhaps, as what they're going to influence the potential for economic development and growth within our relationship with China. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for your insights and connecting everything to little old New Zealand's future. Questions are pouring in from the Q&A function here. Let me choose one relatively randomly. David, does China have the headroom to fulfill the function that it did in 2009 and saving the world economy?
Very much so. China has reformed its banks, which mostly are state-owned, quite aggressively in the last 3 years. The number of non-performing loans that have been forced to be recognized and sold have certainly improved the balance sheets of the main 4 banks. In general terms, China's got the increase in demand and services, the increase in consumption, in a sense, the transformation of the Chinese economy since the global financial crisis means that it's in an even better position. The only trouble is, I don't know if the world is in a better position to receive it, because one thing China does depend on is inputs. It needs componentry, it needs raw materials, and at this stage, things are looking okay. There's a lot of inventory for China to lean on, but as time goes on, will those countries supplying those things be able to go on doing so? Because they're an important fuel for the Chinese economy. So that's one caveat. But I think from the financial perspective and from the scale of the economy since that time, it certainly can be that engine again.
Thank you. Another question. The reforms that we might anticipate from the National People's Congress shortly, do you think freeing up the RMB to become a global currency is one of those reforms that is possible now?
No, and I think China's not ready for it. If we remember that real convertibility of the New Zealand dollar was not really a reality until the early 70s. Currency controls are something that countries need until they have the institutions for the impact of being fully convertible and exposed to the global economy. So I don't think that will happen. It would be unwise for them to do that. But I go to Tony's point where there are very strong signals that a more an accelerated and a more open reform program, economic reform program, is underway. And I think the roots of that began in response to the trade war. not that the trade war hurt the Chinese economy that much, but it gave the Chinese government a sense that they were really facing some major opposition from the US. To maintain the good relationships with other major economies, they had to start being more open. They had to bring a greater fairness to play, but also they remember the wonderful work of Zhurongji. By helping China to join the WTO, he reached out of China and brought in tools, economic tools, for the acceleration and the restructuring of the domestic economy of China. And this is something which, as Tony's indicated, could be in these statements, in these policies. So I think the currency is a long way off. The US dollar is going to dominate for many more years to come, unfortunately. The renminbi eventually, I think, will make its way gradually, a bit like the foreign exchange notes that we once had to use. They were cancelled one New Year's Eve and didn't exist the next day. By then, there was no difference between that and the local currency. So China will be very, very slow in converting the renminbi.
Okay. How about a hardy perennial, just to touch, the hukou system, the household registration system that restricts people to an urban residency or a rural residency and has proved awkward with 300 million plus working illegally in the cities?
That's a tough one. We always hear about hukou reform, but we don't really see it in the major, if you take the 11 coastal provinces, the major cities are pretty jealous of the fact that they see themselves correctly as developed countries. They look to the hinterland of China and they see a developing country. So within one country, you have this extraordinary difference in sophistication, in infrastructure, in household wealth. So I think there is a sense of a wish to preserve those privileges in cities like Shanghai and Beijing, certainly, but also Ningbo, Suzhou, Wuxi. These places are very developed, and I think that they will be less flexible around hukou reform. I think it's the cities further inland, which are also cities that people aspire to go to from villages, from small towns. That's really anyway where the migrant flows are strongest. And I think you will see more hukou reform internally in the perhaps second tier cities than the first tier cities. And then eventually they're going to have to make it for the fact of just keeping their service sectors alive. They must be more flexible eventually on the coast.
Okay. I was struck in the discussion about pushing for Taiwan to regain observer status with the WHO, that no New Zealand politician seems to have said, look, we have a free trade agreement both with Beijing and with Taipei, with Beijing's approval or blessing. Taiwan, have you anything to list about that issue?
Well, any of us who have been to Taiwan have a very deep affection for it. It's a remarkable place, and the Taiwanese are remarkable. I think it's a very simple fact. We accept the one China policy. That's how we get to have an embassy in Beijing. That's how we ended up with a free trade agreement with China, which Tony was a key architect. Then latterly, after that, quite extraordinarily, we managed to get the free trade agreement with Taiwan. That was done with Beijing's blessing. We were very careful to make sure that we were not disturbing anything in the process. And it's a very important step that New Zealand took. And it reflects the kind of independence, the creativity, the independence of mind that New Zealand's been blessed with for most of the last 40 years. This coalition, it's been a little bit of a bumpy time. But I think if we look at the administration of John Key, if we consider Helen Clark's administration, Jim Bolger and his attitude towards China, we had some pretty solid, thoughtful sense of what defines New Zealand's independence and therefore what is appropriate, what's reasonable in terms of our relationship with China. for Taiwan to have status in any international body is the business of Beijing, if we are to accept the one China policy. So in a political sense, we are bound by that if we wish to continue the current relationship. On the other hand, I don't think we should see Taiwan in black and white terms. China and Taiwan will come to an understanding. They will come to a federated, some kind of joining at some point. I don't believe that at any stage since my time in China, which begins in 1984, have I ever thought that the saber rattling or the crises that were supposed to break over Taiwan were going to occur. And I would predict they are not going to occur.
Okay. Tony, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, look, I agree firstly with David. I lived in Taiwan for 3.5 years, and like anyone who spent that sort of time there, one ends up with a huge admiration for what Taiwan has been able to achieve. I worry about Taiwan because I see it as being a potential casualty of a serious deterioration in the China-US relationship. At the present time, I think the consensus in Beijing is that it would not be in China's interest to try to precipitate a confrontation with or over Taiwan. Ultimately, China would win that, but at a huge cost to itself, both in terms of lives lost and in terms of the economic damage that would occur. So I don't think China is in any wish to try and to see a resolution of the Taiwan issue rushed through in a way that provokes much wider ramifications. And there's no way in the current political environment, particularly with what's happening in Hong Kong, that any sentiment towards closer integration, reunification, whatever you call it, with China is going to meet any sort of popular support in Taiwan. And we're at a stage where prospects for reunification are fewer and less than they were 15 years ago. But at the same time, Xi Jinping wants to have something to mark his legacy, and there are many indications that the point that he would like to be remembered for is being the emperor who reunited China. And there will continue to be pressure. He, I'm sure, has entertained dreams that that pressure will lead to somewhere. It's not going to lead anywhere anytime soon. And that's going to make managing the relationship with Taiwan more difficult for us than it has been.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Can I direct a question at David? There's been talk lately of wolf warrior diplomacy, of China being more assertive in the world because it's come through COVID, as it were, and is looking for chances to reestablish its position or strengthen its position in the world. Pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong were arrested a couple of weeks ago, for example. How should we interpret the greater assertiveness that is coming from some quarters in China?
I think that no global power, when it becomes a global power, is ready for it. I used to think that the global financial crisis launched China into a position that it wasn't prepared for, but America wasn't prepared to be the power that it was after the First World War. And I think that China's facing a similar dilemma. It's not ready to deal with the influence that it has. It hasn't managed to match the level of economic influence, the level of social influence, certainly in the region, with the diplomatic reach and depth and sophistication. There's some very, very sophisticated and skilled diplomats in China. There's no question. But they're covering a lot of countries. They're also dealing with a system that is not that flexible. So they are operating on the basis of what they hope will back up the policies and the thinking of their masters in Beijing. And a diplomat needs, as Tony I'm sure will be able to add to, a considerable amount of flexibility in the way that they will address things, the way they phrase things, the way they juxtapose things. And I think in terms of the current Chinese position, the wolf diplomacy is a sign of a bit of a lack of sophistication, an unreadiness, and I would even argue a measure of insecurity. Once China is truly secure, the statements that it makes diplomatically will be far more measured, and sometimes they'll say nothing at all. I would credit Xi Jinping during the trade war with the US. He was an example of a very confident and a very restrained diplomatic position. There was no reaction to Trump's positions. He was very, very careful to say nothing on many occasions. Therefore, China was not inflammatory in that confrontation. That needs to be more widespread through his administration.
So it goes back to this issue of China's soft power, part of which is the Belt and Road Initiative. What's happened to that? Or what will happen to that in these post-COVID times?
Yeah, well, the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't really understand it, to be honest. I watched it start and I thought, well, there's been a recession globally. China's had this massive infrastructure build. Now it's finished that by and large. It doesn't need all these industrial materials. Got to move them offshore. Okay, so you build roads in Pakistan, railroads across Central Asia. It wants richer neighbors. They make more stable neighbors, create middle class in those countries. I got that. Then I saw it spread even further. And I think it's a work in progress for the Chinese government. What I don't see it as is the way it's cast. This terrible phrase that one senator, perhaps on a late night in Washington, coined, which is debt trap diplomacy. China has got no interest in pushing the recipients of its loans and investments into debt. What happened in Sri Lanka was a domestic Sri Lankan issue. It was a corrupt president who misused the funds to build the port. So I think China's genuinely looking to create a stable flow of goods to and fro from China. The maritime aims for that, I think, are significantly already achieved. You know, people keep looking at the route that Marco Polo took to see what's happening with Belt and Road. But Belt and Road is far beyond what crosses land. It's really very much an issue in what's occurring in the maritime structures that China's built. There'll be less money spent. The principle will remain. And I think, if anything, China will be more selective. So it'll be a bit more muted in the coming years, and then it will go back to strength again.
Okay. Tony, I think you have a comment. Demute yourself.
Yeah, I think on the Belt and Road, what we're seeing is a second phase almost of that project. There have been billions of dollars invested in ports, in infrastructure. But I think what is happening now with the BRI is that we're seeing it move to become a digital network. And what China is doing to link the countries of Eurasia generally digitally is probably more important in the long run than the roads, the ports, the highways, the railroads, whatever. That digital infrastructure that China is putting in place, using the resources of Huawei and other companies, but particularly Huawei, that is where I think the BRI significance is increasingly moving.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn back to the Chinese economy, David. The fiscal stimulus that we saw during the GFC kind of slowed down reform moves in China. Is there a danger of that this time?
There could have been. I think the international situation will mean that China needs to actually open further. It needs to, what it's already actually shown some, not just policy announcements, but very concrete actions. Oaktree, which is a stressed assets management firm, has got a license in China, which has given it tremendous abilities to operate in the local currency in renminbi. So I think the financial sector, we're seeing some real developments. And I think that's something which China knows it must do and knew it had to do even before COVID-19. There is always the concern of protectionism. There was a commercial nationalism in China, which is quite strong. And in some areas, one has to look at the fact that why is it that the American Chamber of Commerce, that used to be such an ally to the Chinese economy and its engagement with the world, is now silent? You know, I can't believe it's just been bullied into submission by Donald Trump. There's a lot of foreign companies that are unhappy with the treatment they receive in China. So I think China will actually spend a lot of energy or a lot of effort trying to address those factors. So for its own economic survival as a practical administration, I don't think that we're going to see a slowing of reform. I think we'll see more reform as a result of this crisis.
Okay. Now, I'd like to take it all back to New Zealand now in the last minutes of this webinar. Let's first do some Australia bashing. How can we continue to differentiate ourselves? Are we managing still to be different from Australia? Or could we get caught up in either Australia-China disputes or the US-China standoff?
We haven't historically, and I don't think we need to now. I agree that the Prime Minister has, in most cases, always come to correct a position that did not reflect the government's core view. That occurred when the GCSB said that there was or Spark announced, sorry, that there was an issue with Huawei on security concerns. And the handling of that initially was pretty ham-fisted. But once the Prime Minister came out and qualified New Zealand's position, it was understood that this was not a blanket ban, that we were considering the pros and cons of Huawei. And very quickly, she got an invitation to visit Beijing. I think as Tony said, and how she managed the concerns around Taiwan and the WHO, particularly our role in the global investigation into COVID-19 through WHO, those statements were very well pitched. So I think we are a country that so cares for our own independence. We don't accept the bullying of Canberra or Washington or the expectations of London. And that's innate to New Zealanders. So I think we'll navigate this reasonably well. I don't think we would, though, if we end up having a coalition that includes New Zealand First again. Because at some stage, a government has to speak out against its coalition partner if its coalition's partner's view do not represent government policy. And early on, that wasn't happening. So I think if we can go to not have to have a New Zealand First coalition partner in September, we're on pretty solid ground because we have a Prime Minister and a cabinet that's well principled and seems to understand the issues.
Okay. Will we see Chinese tourists returning to New Zealand once our bubble is burst and our borders are opened up to the world? Will Chinese potential tourists still have an interest in us?
I think so. I think the way in which this whole crisis has been managed to date, with the, we think of a government imposing a lockdown. I remember, because I was here when it began, there was a spontaneous unity within New Zealand that, yeah, we'll do this. It's fair. We're not sure of the best thing to do, but this is the thing to do. I think this has been observed as we have observed South Korea and Taiwan and what they have managed to do, how we've observed Singapore and Hong Kong, and our alarm at looking at the United Kingdom and the US. So I think it'll be looked upon as being a safe place to go. The concern is, how are we going to manage the infrastructure for testing and tracing to actually encompass the kind of tourism that we want to rebuild in New Zealand? I think that's more the issue. I think once that's dealt with, I'm sure that Chinese tourists will again wish to come to New Zealand.
What new or reinforced opportunities are there for New Zealand exporters post-COVID, as you see it?
I think there are two things. I look at the produce sector, which we're involved with, and you're looking at very strong performance by Zespri. Its season is only just over a month old. Rocket Apples, Turners and Growers are all doing very well. The products are being shipped to China and distributed efficiently. So, there are some caveats in terms of first quarter performance, but I think the aggregate is looking strong. I think the same for our other primary producers. So I don't think there's an issue for New Zealand in terms of our traditional trade with China. One of the areas, though, that I think we could concentrate more on as an economy, not just for China, but globally, is that the area of technology is often talked about. It is not well funded. It is not well husbanded. We have a situation where we have a number of very, very brilliant small companies. They don't have enough money to grow. They remain small. New Zealand needs to think what we do with our $50 billion. I think what we do with it is we create, with part of it, a fund that is managed by both the private and state sector. We invite a number of key players to help manage that fund, key commercial people. We want John Key and Bill English involved. We want Helen Clark involved. So rather than government picking winners in a very difficult sector, we have a very experienced and very wise group of fund managers managing a government fund. So we build those businesses. So we have more to sell than just our primary produce, but all the technology and know-how and science that has grown around the development of that. And the other is entertainment and culture and the arts. We are known globally, not because of a 100% pure campaign, as powerful as it was, but Lord of the Rings. We're the country of imagery. We're the country of storytelling, of poetry. And I think we need to look at that aspect of our economy and make sure that there are the commercial means for these aspects to actually be something that people want to come and engage with, and we can also export to China.
Thank you. I think we'll draw this now to a close. It remains for me to thank our two speakers, Tony, for your insights, and David particularly for taking time to be with us and drawing a great wisdom, I think, built up over 3+ decades in China and in many other places. So thank you both very much indeed. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending this webinar. We hope this will become the first of a series of North Asia Cape post-COVID webinars. We'll have one in June and try to cover China, Japan, Korea, part of our mandate. We're anxious to hear from you, your views on today's session and on what more the Cape could be doing in helping New Zealanders engage with that part of the world. But for now, thank you very much and goodbye. Mā te wā.